Welcome to this week's episode of the Trip Sitting Podcast. This week we have Ashley Southard, who I found originally on Instagram, and I saw that she spoke at like all these different psychedelic events. And so naturally I wanted to follow her, and man, she's got some fucking great wisdom, and she is really, really smart and super fucking down to earth. And I had just such a good time like listening back on this conversation, and I'm just so fucking happy that we connected. And hopefully I get to actually meet her soon at Psychedelic Science. I believe she's going to be in Denver for it, but either way, regardless, she's a dope human being. We had a great conversation. And this is also like the first episode that I'm releasing, obviously, since last episode, in which I did that solo journey on 5 grams of mushrooms. So if you haven't checked that out, be sure to check that out. And then also, too, want to give a quick shout out to my weekly newsletter called Trippy Mondays, where I just go over 3 things that I learned that caught my attention, that just happened from like the previous week that I release every Monday. So go to tripsitting.blog and subscribe to that. Or if you go to like my link in my bio on my Instagram, once again, at tripsitting.blog, you can go ahead and find it there as well. So be sure to subscribe. And, if you don't like it, if it's, fucking up your inbox, just fucking unsubscribe. But, give it a shot. That's what life is about. Just trying new things. But without further ado, here is my podcast with Ashley. Enjoy. But no, it's crazy. I guess like just thinking about, my own progress in this and looking at sort of the way that I saw the psychedelic landscape when I first started doing this versus how I see it now. It feels like everything is just moving so fucking quickly.
Yeah.
And it's like it's kind of hard to keep track of. Like there's so many more studies that are coming out every single day. There's so many more articles that are coming out every day. And at least in my opinion, I feel like whenever I see things in the mainstream news about psychedelics, it's all just like way too overwhelmingly positive.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
I totally agree. It's like psychedelics can fix your brain. You're missing a lot of information there, And I think.
No, sorry. You go. I mean to interrupt.
No worries. I think it's on us and people in the space to be louder for sure about how it's not. Yes, it's the molecules, it's the plants, the psychedelics, but it's like 98% what you do with them before, after, during. That is the true, like that's what's truly effective.
Yeah. I guess what do you think is the best way to actually get that message out to people that are not in this space? Because like I have these discussions with people that like you that are actively in this space, and people like Dennis, obviously from Micropreneur, and like we'll very openly and honestly say things like that. Like this is not a molecule that's just going to magically fix everything. This is something that used to be used with intention, used with respect, and also with respect to all of the indigenous cultures that have been using these for thousands of years. But yet when the mainstream media is just covering all of the positive stuff, like how do we get the large scale consumer to listen to people like us?
It's a really great question that I don't think we have the true solutions for, that we haven't really, really sat down and like industry powwow of how we do this. I think that a lot of it needs to come down to focusing on accessible education around general well-being practices, that then you can just like drop in, oh, hey, psychedelics can actually further this. But our system and how we do not educate on basic things, just like nutrition, prevents, it sets us up for a situation where a sensationalized title like, psychedelics fix your brain, everybody's like clinging to that because they're like suffering so much because they're like eating garbage and not feeling good and like trying to understand. Like one doctor will give them medication to increase or decrease their blood pressure. The other one's going to like increase it. And like, you find these scenarios where it's just absolute insanity because nobody's stepping back and looking at the big picture. And so I think it's not so much about talking about how psychedelics are not the mecca, but how other things are, if that makes sense. Like how other things, and I think we are seeing a shift in that, like how popular Mark Hyman and like Tim Ferriss and all these people really are buying into them. And I think that is a plus side of social media, right? Like a lot of this stuff is shared on Instagram and TikTok. Instagram and TikTok are terrible for like, depending on who you follow. But if this is also how those types of resources are coming across, that's normalizing that kind of self-care also, the well-being.
Yeah. I think like to build on that point, like just being more conscious of all of the things that we consume as a society, like again, like the things that you watch on TV, the people that you follow on social media, the things that you put into your body, like the sunlight that you get, how often you're saying, you know, inside, and like all of these different things, basically like all of this different energy that you're absorbing from all of these different places, like that's going to holistically affect your entire mood and like your entire self.
Yeah. And psychedelics are a great way, I think, for people to recognize how those energies are affecting them. Like I remember one of the times I did LSD and I sat there on my balcony and I was like, there are so many noises and like things that my brain and body have to filter through on a regular basis just to function. And like, I'm not aware of it, but how amazing is it that like my brain is able to filter all that out and focus on what I need to. And I think we like forget sometimes how amazing this machine is that we are inside, and we don't give ourselves enough credit, and we don't do what we need to do to like sit down, like breathe for, 2 minutes the way we did before we started this podcast. But I think that psychedelics do help us zoom in to those practices, but those practices don't need psychedelics to happen.
Yeah, 100%. And I can relate to that in the sense that like, I never used to like meditate. I never used to be like super cautious about who I follow on social media and like the things that I even consume on TV. And like, honestly, even like my friends that I hung out with on like a normal basis, like I never used to be receptive to that different energy. And like, to me too, it was, I mean, psychedelics basically helped me become aware and honestly believe in that like everything is energy and everything has energy that like our bodies have to basically sift through. Like I definitely grew up, being like very strict, if science can't prove this directly with like a direct hypothesis, like fuck that, I'm not going to believe it. Like show me once you have some real hardcore physical evidence. But since I've started using psychedelics, like I've noticed those things and help me become more conscious and become more aware of those things. But even once you are conscious and aware of them, changing them is then still like a whole other beast that you have to tackle.
Oh yeah. And like, that's the hardest part of the whole journey, I think. And that's why, like, when we look at psychedelics in certain situations, people will come out of a journey or a trip and be like so shaken up because they're not in a position they can change things. And that's really, really like defeating almost. And so that's another reason why we need to be mindful of like throwing this on the news, on the headlines, and people who like really aren't in a space to hold themselves after or to make the shifts that psychedelics prompt someone to change. Like we need to handle that responsibly, go slower. It reminds me of like anytime I speak to someone who's wanting to start a microdosing regimen or wanting to even go do a big journey. And I'm like, do you have a meditation practice? Like, do you have a journaling practice? Do you have like morning pages from the Artist Way? Like, I cannot live without that. But like, do you have any kind of baseline measurement for you to understand? Like, okay, this is where I am. This is where I am in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. And if that doesn't exist, then you're literally just setting yourself up for an explosion of like, and then like a lot of pieces to pick up without an understanding.
Yeah, one of the things that I think I struggle with the most, at least when I think about that, because like you hit the nail on the head there, like you need to have resources or you need to have things put in place to help you continue the practice. But the way that at least I see the landscape right now, it's only really accessible to wealthier upper class individuals that can afford to pay a microdosing coach, $100 a week to help them with these things. Whereas the people that probably need this the most simply cannot afford it.
Yeah. Or there's fear around it because they're in marginalized communities where like getting caught with something is actually like pretty terrifying and not just something that can be brushed off like like
Yeah. I very much realize, I mean, so like one of the things that I joked around about, and I mean, we'll probably do now that I live in Denver, is like, I want to start experimenting with growing mushrooms. I realize what an insane place of privilege that is, that I get to say, like, I can just go fuck around and do that. Like,
yeah.
I'm really just not worried about that. Of course, obviously mushrooms are, I think, technically legal now here, at least to own and to grow, but not legal to sell. But there's so many other places where obviously that's not the case. So like, it's very much a privilege that we get to even have this discussion right here without worrying about being marginalized and like worrying about sort of what, the people around us are going to think just because we put ourselves in this community.
It's very true, which is why I like tip my hat to all of the people working on legislation and all of that. Like, I have very little understanding of it. I feel like there's a bill and a this and a this, like all around all the time. And I'm like, how do you guys stay on top of all of this? Like, you guys are superheroes, but like, they're the ones that are really doing this. And I know that there are issues right now around like patient data and safety and how this can be legalized or decriminalized. I know with the aspect of, okay, patient safety, this is why we need to collect data, but then there's patient privacy. And it's just really interesting to see this all unfold. And then you think about how beyond just psychedelic data, you also have the future of health tech and Web3 and like people wanting to own their own health data instead of their doctors owning the data. And it's just like, what are the next 10 years going to look like? It's like exciting and kind of scary and overwhelming, but it's happening, right?
Yeah. I mean, psychedelics have helped me just like zoom out and see the bigger picture. And like, again, like sometimes I think you get so narrowly focused on something that like you have trouble seeing things outside of that. So like being able to zoom out and see the whole system really made me realize how fucked the system is. Like it's a system that needs like a complete overhaul. Like psychedelics themselves are not going to fix the healthcare system. Like it's the healthcare system. And then I'm like, okay, well, psychedelics kind of work in the healthcare system, but to the point that we were talking about earlier, it's really the education system that probably needs the biggest overhaul. Because if we're teaching these things to children when they're young, like about all of these wellness practices, about meditation, about taking time and slowing down, and not throwing them into this society that just demands people be fucking productive their entire lives, that's probably going to see like the biggest shift. But again, then you don't have people going into hospitals, you don't have people getting treated, and then, money's not flowing around the way that the system's currently designed.
And that's it, right? It's the way the system's currently designed. So it takes some sort of shift in, okay, recognizing money will always exist in some capacity. And so what is the system that facilitates the flow properly, and properly being for the benefit of humankind and the planet, as opposed to like the small percentage of pockets in the pharmaceutical and like governmental agencies. But that's like a whole other story with a lot of politics involved. But I just think it's wild how like 1 in 5 people in America suffers from depression or anxiety. And like, that's just not okay. And yes, a lot of those people can be helped with psychedelics, and the whole psychedelic conversation is definitely like I think really hammering home how this is a problem. But a lot of it can be fixed just with diet. A lot of it can be fixed just with like moving 5 days a week instead of watching Netflix for 3 hours a day after work. And it's hard. Like, that's the thing. It's hard to shift your habits from something you're already used to. If you're used to kind of living in this cycle of, oh, this is my job. Oh, I get home, I'm tired. I'm too tired to move. Like, it does take often like a snap, which psychedelics do. But it can also come in the form of like changing, as you mentioned, like who you follow on Instagram and all of that. Like I don't know if I read this or saw it on Instagram, but there was this, I think it was a woman saying, get rid of everybody on your like social media that you wouldn't be excited to see at a grocery store. Like, when you're in a grocery store, you see someone and you're like, I don't really whatever. Like, if you feel that way about anyone, stop following them. Like, only surround yourself like with I guess, like sources of inspiration and joy and like love, right? Because at the end of the day, everything comes down to one coin, and on one side it's love and on one side it's fear. It's like, where are we acting from?
Yeah. I mean, simply just coming from a place of love and basically just like spreading love into the community, like that's going to solve it. But I think just like our culture is so deprived of love. Like
Yes.
everything that I see, every advertisement that I see, you know, basically targeting me is basically saying like, you're not good enough as you are, but if you get this product or this thing or start doing this, then you'll be good enough. And that just subconsciously creates the idea in my mind that I'm not good enough as I am. And once I start thinking that, that's just going to be like my baseline state, is that I'm never good enough until I get to the next thing or start doing the next practice or whatever it is, rather than just focusing on how do I feel the absolute best right now in my current state without the need for any other external source.
Yeah. And you hit on it, how, you know, fear, that's the basis of marketing. I mean, I majored in marketing. I am a marketer. And like, everybody knows that you make your like buyer personas, and like, what are their fears? What do they don't like? What don't they like about themselves? And like, that's how you market to them. And it's kind of sad that that's the reality, but that is what makes people buy. But then that is what perpetuates this like complete lack of self-worth, and there's something wrong with me, and all of this. And so it really, you know, yeah.
Do you still work in marketing?
I do more strategy and branding. I do marketing strategy, but I think that a lot of it comes down to positioning a brand or business and establishing the strategy within that, the company itself and externally facing, to communicate the values, not necessarily like the problems that those values are serving. Every company and service solves a problem. You don't necessarily need to fearmonger people into buying your product or service. You can exist, you know, simply. It's kind of like that quote, how do you show that a stick is crooked? You place a straight stick next to it. Like, you don't need to keep talking about the other stick being crooked.
Yeah, basically like showing inherent value in your product without diminishing the value of the people, or like, I guess, you know, other things that they could be doing. Simply just, I don't know, just speaking facts and like speaking truth and just speaking like from authenticity, which I think we don't like doing so much because like it's a much slower process. Like it takes people a longer time. Yeah.
It's also scary for a lot of people, whether we're talking about like marketing or just, you know, existing and human connection. Like, it's terrifying to speak your truth sometimes, because we're in a space where we're supposed to like cover ourselves up in this like mask of, I can do everything and everything is like perfect and all of that. And like, the reality is we're all so much more alike than we think, and we all just want to connect. And if we're just speaking truthfully with each other, it becomes so much more powerful and stronger. But there's fear in that, fear of judgment. And going back to psychedelics, I think that they are a tool that help people see like, oh, this is just my ego's fear. I can actually be completely open and it'll be okay.
Yeah, it's I'm kind of thinking back on this one time. So like I have some friends that like have never touched psychedelics or like tried psychedelics at all. And earlier that day, like I just did like a solo trip by myself, like with LSD. And then like I met up with them afterwards. So like I'm still coming down. And I also don't recommend anybody to like go out and do all these things afterwards unless like you're very, very experienced to know what you're doing. I've done this once or twice before, so that's why I felt comfortable enough to do this. But please don't follow my footsteps. But basically, like, you know, they were like asking me questions while I was on this, and I guess just doing things and asking questions. And like, I was being so unbelievably like blunt and straightforward, but like, it was so like clear that it was coming from a place of love, because that's what psychedelics help me do. Like, it helps me really connect with that loving place. But I realized after the fact, like the next day, I'm like, if I would have said the exact same things, not on a psychedelic, and like, had they have no idea, like I probably would have came off like a complete dick. Really? Just because normally, I mean, again, like just because I think we don't, like, at least me, like sometimes I have trouble just being like very, very straightforward and blunt with people, because I know that like it can it can hurt sometimes, but like it's never meant to. And so just all in like the way that people perceive things that we say. I say all this to say, if we were just more honest with each other, like completely honest 100% of the time, knowing that it was not coming from a place of hate and it was all coming from a place of love, things would just be so much easier.
They would be, right? It's kind of like kids. Kids will say anything because kids are like the purest form, right? Like they are not burdened by like the fact that they shouldn't tell you that they just pooped their pants because, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Or like even so like I guess like an example of that is like I know that like if I were to ask my kid like you know some kid, if I'm wearing like an outfit that's like kind of goofy, I'm like, do I look good? They're like, no, not really. Like if my friend were to ask me that and I were to be like, no, not really, I'd come off as kind of a dick.
Yeah, it's true. And like I think we need to start realizing that nothing is really ever an offense to us, right?
No.
It's always just it's just stated, and sometimes it's colored by lenses that the other person is seeing that like aren't even us, and then other times it's like, okay, you might feel that way, but I don't. I like this outfit.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
like these weird
like,
shoes.
Exactly. Like understanding that like I don't need somebody else's approval in order to like feel good going out about it. And that's like at our core sort of how we live, is like we expect external approval for the things that we do constantly because like we don't believe and love ourselves enough.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, kind of switching gears here, I guess, when did your kind of relationship with psychedelics begin?
I guess 4 or 5 years ago at this point. It's funny because I grew up in Miami, born and raised here. So I was around a lot of drugs all the time. And I never wanted to touch them because I saw what they did to people. And I was like, I don't want to like get addicted to blues and Roxy's and like just, you know, and I was prescribed SSRIs and anti-anxiety meds like from age 14 or 15, way too much of a cocktail. And I was like, also part of me was like, I don't want to try anything. Like I'm scared of what that interaction will do. And then I had started my marketing and branding agency with my co-founder 5 years ago at this point, called Healer Collective. And she was like, you need to microdose psilocybin. Like, you need to get off these SSRIs. Like, I promise you will feel so much better. And I was like, sure, like, I guess. I'm like, it's not going to break my brain. She's like, no, like, it's not. So I tried it, and that didn't help me get off SSRIs. Ibogaine was the only thing that did. But it did, like, open me up to realize, like, okay, this is totally safe. Like, nothing bad's happening. And, I mean, prior to that, I was really into alternative health from probably age 15 or 16. I was a dancer, ballet, and then, you know, I had some injuries and the doctor was like, you need to stop, get into yoga or Pilates or something like that. Got into yoga, got my teacher training certified when I was like 19. And so I was really in this like wellness, meditation, knowing this. So I think I came into psychedelics with a major understanding of how necessary the container of the whole body is versus just like taking a trip. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it unfolded from there. Talia and I, my co-founder, had started Ibogaine Research Institute to raise awareness for Iboga as a solution to opiate addiction disorder. And I mean, it evolved from there. The plants find you, right?
Yeah, they certainly do. So I want to talk about Iboga because at least from my personal experience, that's definitely one of the psychedelics that helps so many people, but I think people probably know the least about. So could you give me a background? What is Iboga? What's the difference between Iboga and Ibogaine and all that fun stuff you're doing with the Research Institute?
Yeah. So Iboga is a plant from Africa, and the medicine is used from the root bark of it. It is traditionally used in the Bwiti religion as kind of like, well, they use it in microdoses for like hunting and all of that, but in macrodoses for vision quests and all of that kind of stuff. So it's important to also recognize that they don't use it very often for actual ailments or addiction. Well, they do use it because they recognize it, but their purpose, just like other indigenous cultures that use psychedelics, is more for connection and, you know, historical learnings and all of that. But Ibogaine was discovered basically for its use for addiction by Lotsof and that crew in like the 60s, 70s. And someone gave it to him and was like, try this. It's a really strong trip. So he tried it.
Fuck it, I'm game.
And he woke up the next day and had no desire to touch heroin. And he was a heroin addict. So he was like, to his friends, he was like, you got to try this. And everyone experienced the same thing. They were like, whoa, we don't have a desire to touch this stuff. And that's when it was he started to research and do all of that stuff. But Ibogaine is a very powerful experience. The difference between Iboga and Ibogaine: Iboga has 12 alkaloids. Ibogaine is an alkaloid. So Ibogaine is the basically most pure form. It's what's used in the clinical settings. There's Iboga TA, which is total alkaloid, means like the pure form, like it is all Iboga, like the plant. And then there's PTA, which is purified total alkaloid. It has 3 alkaloids, and anywhere from 70 to 90% of it is Ibogaine. And then you have Ibogaine HCl, which is 100% Ibogaine. And that is what most clinics use, at least within South America and these clinics. In traditional, like in Africa, they do use Iboga.
Got it.
You basically need more of it to have as strong of a response. And it's still not 1,000% or 100% clear how it works in the body. When you do it, it's an 8 to 12 hour trip. And then about 24 hours after, where you're still pretty out of it. Like you can't really be doing much. So it is a longer experience than most. There are potential heart issues if you have pre-existing heart conditions that can all be prevented as long as you're in the proper setting with a nurse watching you. If there's any issue with the heart, like arrhythmia of any kind, you can be, something can go in your IV to fix it. So realistically, it's actually it's like as safe as any kind of anesthesia process, as long as you're watched and taken care of and not slipping your, opiates if you're detoxing. That is the biggest problem that happens with clinics who are using Ibogaine to get people off opiates. If they're not watched like hawks, those people will sometimes go and find some medication they brought with them, and that interaction is just terrible, and that does lead to death. And that's why there have been a few deaths in some studies years and years ago, like in New Zealand and stuff. But Iboga gets a really bad rep as being the really dangerous psychedelic, when the reality is ayahuasca has also caused a lot of deaths that just go unreported because it's in the jungles of Peru, and as long as things are done safely, everything is fine.
Yeah, I think that's true for just about anything. As long as you are intentional in the way that you use it and what you're doing, you're probably going to be safe 99.999% of the time.
It's true. It's very true.
So what was your personal experience with Ibogaine? How did you originally come across it?
So we had started a nonprofit, and I never tried it. I got behind it because I saw so many people with addiction issues here in Miami. And acquaintances who passed and all of that. And it never called to me really, because I was like, I'm not addicted to anything. I don't have a substance problem. And then it started to really call to me, I would say 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. And I was like, you know what? Screw it. It's calling. I know when a plant's calling me. And so I did it. And I was at a point in my life where I was Saturn return, I'd say I was in. And if anybody's familiar with Saturn return, that's a doozy. And so I just did it. And I came out with a lot of truths about myself that I recognized, that I knew from doing psilocybin journeys. But it's I think that when you do a psilocybin journey, often you see a lot of the patterns that are created in your life, or your past behaviors and why you do things. And it takes a lot of work after to then implement the learnings from those realizations. Ibogaine basically stripped my ability to even apply previous patterns. It was like, okay, you did psilocybin, but you still kind of fell back on your negative thought patterns. I'm just going to rip those out of your brain so you can't even have them. and that was that. Like,
yeah.
And I mean, I was still on SSRIs and sleeping pills at the time. And I had been on sleeping pills for a decade. And I work a lot. Like, I'm a workaholic, very type A. So I know how important sleep is. And if I didn't take sleeping pills, I'd get an hour. And that's just not reasonable. So it was one of those things where, you know, I also encountered a lot of kind of imposter syndrome, like being in the psychedelic and wellness space, but like, I can't get off these stupid sleeping pills. Like, come on, you hypocrite, right? But I, you know, I was gentle with myself because you need sleep. And if you're not getting it, you know, not good for you. So when I did Ibogaine the first time, the next day I was like, I'm not going to take anything. And then I just never took anything again. No SSRIs, no sleeping pills, sleep fine, as long as I don't drink coffee after 2 p.m., you know, like, which is another thing. Like,
Interesting. You're telling me no late caffeine?
Yeah, no late caffeine. I have theories behind that, by the way, because like why people, like Americans are so over caffeinated and can't sleep. Like, if you go anywhere else in the world, the coffees you get are like so small.
Yep.
So small.
You're telling me that my 24-ounce Starbucks coffee with 48 grams of sugar in it and 140 milligrams of caffeine has a bit too much. We wonder why
we're like on edge.
I've never been like a coffee drinker at all myself. Like, just because like I did when I worked for this one startup. I dropped out of school for a semester. I was working for a startup. It was a coffee shop down the street, and we always used to get cold brews every morning. And I always used to feel like fucking shit.
It's like rocket fuel. No, I went.
It's terrible.
I went to coffee with a friend yesterday, actually, and he was like, I got iced coffee, and he got cold brew. He's like, why don't you want cold brew? I was like, you check in with me in like 3 or 4 hours. You tell me how you feel.
Mm-hmm. It's so weird though how people like get addicted to those things. Like, I mean, I don't think caffeine's talked about nearly enough as far as like most addictive substances on earth. I think caffeine is literally one of the top most addictive substances on earth, but for whatever reason, we don't see it as that.
That and sugar.
Yeah.
Sugar. Like, sugar is the top. And what's scary is how much of an effect so much of it has on your gut, which then controls a lot of the neurotransmitters that your brain uses. And just like everything is connected. Everything.
Yeah. So all of these really holistic practices can be used before anybody even touches psychedelics. And that's what people need to understand. Like, exactly. Psychedelics have just helped me look at health in such a more holistic approach. So if you're at a spot where, you know, again, you're very narrow-minded and you simply just don't believe anything that a lot of these people are saying, psychedelics can be a good jolt to the system. That I'll say. But like, if you're not ready for that, like, I'll never tell somebody, hey, you need to start taking psychedelics. Like it's baby steps, and like, you don't need to get there perfectly. And something you even just said was like, with regards to having like imposter syndrome, you're like, well, I'm talking about psychedelics, I'm in the health and wellness space, and yet like I can't get off these pills. That just comes back to like being comfortable, being honest and authentic, and just speaking your truth. Like, I think we expect ourselves to be so perfect, much more so than anybody else actually gives a shit. Totally. And like, everybody else is also worrying about themselves being perfect. Nobody actually cares about you. Like in that way. People care about you. People love you. But I mean, like, nobody cares. Nobody cares that like you worked 7.5 hours today instead of 8 because you were so tired and I had a headache. Like, it's okay. Yeah, exactly. Like, just giving more grace to yourself and then to others around you, I think just solves a lot of problems. Again, like injecting love into the system. But like, us talking about our imperfections, especially within the psychedelic space, I think is also very helpful and gives other people permission to not try to be perfect all the time. Because if you're just trying to be perfect, like, that doesn't exist. Yeah. And you hit on something so strongly that I've learned in the last few years, especially, and tried to put into practice, that like, you give others permission to be more fully themselves when you are more fully yourself.
And whether that's speaking truthfully or like expressing yourself fully, like if you love to dance, like just getting on the dance floor and dancing, because like everybody's going to join you. Like everybody's just afraid to be that person. So like when you have the courage, and it does take a lot of courage to just like be so fully you, you are giving other people so much more of like a breath that they can be themselves too.
Yeah. And that goes back to what we were talking about at the way beginning, which is like energy. Like I can feel the energy of somebody who's like fully themselves and just confident in that. And like, it's like contagious. Yeah. Like you will, if you hang out around people that are always themselves and authentic, like you will just naturally start doing things yourself that feel you and that feel authentic.
Yeah. And I think it's so important to continue to, you know, refine like a marble sculpture, like refine away anything that does not make you feel inspired or true. And then like everything falls into place energetically or like anything. It's remarkable.
Yeah. And something that I'm, I guess, kind of working through right now is really getting comfortable with the idea that while I am doing these things and like I have started, you know, doing this podcast and networking with people in this space and like helping people go on retreats, is like I can also change those things at any time. Yeah. I'm not locked into this right now, and like I don't owe anybody else an explanation. If I start doing something completely different, they're like, "Oh, I thought you did this." I'm like, "Yeah, I mean, I did, but now I do this." Like that's completely fine. You're not bound to whatever it is that you're doing right now.
And that is something that that a friend talks about a lot. Like, never be afraid to just reinvent yourself. Like, if something doesn't feel true for you anymore, just don't do it. Do what does feel true, you know?
Yep. Simply stop. But it is scary because, again, you get used to things and you get comfortable. And it's also not as simple as just being like, stop, new thing. Like, it's a process where, like, you, as humans, we have these emotions that come up. And I'm still working on my own relationship with my own emotions. And I'll still catch myself feeling a certain way, thinking that I shouldn't be feeling a certain way, and then just trying to like move past it. But like once you start feeling that way, like that energy is now stuck inside of your body, and it's going to continue to carry inside your body until like you actually sit down and just like feel all of those emotions.
1,000%. You face it and you just keep asking why. Like for me, why do you feel this way? Okay, why? And then you just like, you hammer it with why until you eventually get to the point that like, oh, it's because of this fear of, like, it's always just a fear of something. And then you realize, facing it, having that conversation with yourself, that's okay. I can hold that fear, and I can also hold like things can coexist. I can hold the fear of XYZ with the inspiration to do ABC, right?
Mm-hmm. Duality. So switching gears again for a second, I know that you've obviously spoken at a lot of psychedelic conferences over the last year or two, and that you've been involved kind of from the beginning of this ever-changing, ever-growing industry. How have you seen it shift over since you joined until now? And also too, after that, you know, where do you expect to see this grow, and like how fast?
Yeah, so in the last 4 or 5 years, I've definitely seen a last ones or true ones standing now. A lot of money went into this space. A lot of companies tried to launch, whether it was because it was like cannabis people seeing something exciting, or it was like finance people being like, oh, this is the next big thing. And they like filled a C-suite full of nice faces, and like made some pretty decks, but didn't have any actual execution. And that's coming out now. We see that in a lot of companies closing or being bought out by others, and share prices just slashing. And part of that is, of course, as a result of the market. But then there's other companies that have held their ground on share price because they are actual true companies with true value, true portfolio, true portfolio value. And so I think especially now, we are seeing more conversation around how to do this properly, responsibly. People are realizing that it's not just a new pill, and it is, thankfully, I'm thinking, a shift in how do we implement this in the healthcare system. How do we train people to be able to hold this kind of space? How do we make this accessible? I do still worry that there are people who are like, oh, this is the next gold rush, like the next pharmaceutical gold rush. And the reality is that this shouldn't be so profitable if it's done properly. Like, that's the truth. Like, we shouldn't be wanting people on pills every single day. And what this really is about is improving well-being. And we're looking at how, how can we, in the same way that the healthcare model, it does provide jobs, it does provide income. This just needs to be an improved version of this. So it's an ecosystem of support. And that is my hope for the continual evolution of this industry, that it's not just the focus on the psychedelics, it's the containers around it. It's how can we use things like the metaverse and Web3 to make these things accessible to people that can't go to Costa Rica or Mexico for 3 to 10 days at a time. Like, how do we meet people where they are truly? And then there's the whole aspect that we talked about earlier where I'm like, I don't understand this at all. But the the decriminalization, the legalization, what does that look like? Yeah. And unfortunately, that's not profitable, right? That's all lobbyists and people doing this pretty much for the greater good to legalize this or decriminalize to make it accessible to others.
Yeah. I worry, and I guess not really even a worry, but like, I guess my hypothesis is that the community of underground advocates that are doing this in a responsible way is just going to move so much faster than legal legislation and all of that like that's really what's going to pave the way, like rather than waiting for states to legalize and then set up therapy clinics where you could walk in and do this legally. Like, it's really going to kind of be up to the people that want to use these things in a responsible manner that are just going to have to find it.
It's true. And that's why I think there needs to be a lot of resources by people like you and like podcasts and all of that, talking about and having the conversations that, no, this isn't the Mecca. No, this isn't like the magic bullet. You need to do the work around it. And to your point, I think that we're going to see a lot more churches around this because, the federal government doesn't want to, like, the whole religious debate is a whole issue and they have other fish to fry. And I think that church use, religious use is going to be that's a market that's going to get bigger in the next, I would say, 2 to 5 years, like a lot bigger than we see it now. And again, it goes down to who are the facilitators in those churches? Are they people that are motivated by truth and love, or are they motivated by the fact that this actually is really profitable because, it's scary. Yeah. I know there's a church here in Florida that will pack a room of literally 100 people doing ayahuasca, and that's just not okay.
That's insane.
It's not okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just irresponsible. And so, like, as the consumer, as whoever you are, like, just be informed, like, do your research. This is not something to rush into. I think is the biggest thing that I can probably tell people is, like, do not rush into this. Like, even if you're feeling really terrible and at rock bottom, like, you've still made it this far. Wait until you like feel comfortable and like understand what it is that you're doing before you start fucking around with things that are literally rewiring your brain chemistry.
Yeah. And especially in group settings like that, where like it's rewiring your brain chemistry in a group that's also rewiring their brain chemistry energetically. Like, you don't need that. Like, you just don't. Imagine going to, like, I don't know, a small concert or like a movie theater. That's literally like doing ayahuasca in a theater with other people. Like, that's how many people it is, right? Like, that doesn't sound good.
No, doesn't sound comfortable at all. Yeah, especially when you just have that. And like, I mean, to your point, when you were talking about how like sitting on LSD, you were able to notice all of these things and pick up on all these things that normally your brain filters out. You're in a group with 100 people like that. The amount of energy that you are now absorbing from all of these other people, all of these other sounds and all of that, like, I don't know how you would ever be able to even focus on your own healing at that point.
Yeah, I tell people all the time, like, even if you think that, like, ayahuasca is traditionally done in a group, whether it's 5 people or 100 people, they're psilocybin even, but I tell people, like, if you know that you'd rather be alone, find a facilitator that will sit with you alone, because you're just going to like hurt yourself almost. Like you may not hurt yourself, but you're definitely not going to get as much out of the experience as if you were going to do the experience in a position you know is more comfortable to you.
Yeah, 100%. And regardless of how much I preach about get comfortable being uncomfortable, there are certain things in which you should be a bit comfortable beforehand.
Yes. Yes.
Well, Ashley, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge and just having a dope conversation with me. Like, I really appreciate it so much, and really look forward to seeing how this the industry evolves, and also like how you and I evolve within it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I love talking to people in the space. I love what you do. And I think, I'm grateful, endlessly grateful for opportunities to talk about it.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to listen to this podcast or watch it if you're on YouTube. If you want to get in contact with Ashley, I'm going to link to all of her shit in my footnotes of this podcast. So be sure to go follow her, check her out, reach out to her. And yeah, so also as well, if you could, like, rate, subscribe to the Trip Sitting podcast, that helps us just get in front of more people. And be sure to follow us on all of the socials at tripsitting.blog. And if you are listening this far, which most people don't, but if you are, I really appreciate you. I love you, and I wish you the best, and we'll see you next week.